Hi there, and welcome to the Journalist Resources final webinar for 2023, How to Cover Academic Research Fraud and Errors. I'm the managing editor of the Journalist Resource. For those of you who aren't yet familiar with us, we are a small team of journalists who are working really hard to help journalists all over the world find and use high quality evidence in their coverage of public policy topics. And one way we do that is by steering them toward peer-reviewed academic research, or more specifically, research articles that are published in academic journals. Now, we know that the peer review process is imperfect. We know that researchers are human and make mistakes without meaning to, but there are also errors that are intentional. Today's webinar is meant to help journalists detect and report on research and researcher misconduct, like intentional and unintentional errors, made up or manipulated data or images, information that is presented or written in a misleading way, ethical violations and other actions that can or do influence a study's findings, and intentional delays in fixing bad information. Today, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with three experts who have a lot of expertise in either covering research misconduct or doing hands-on work in tracking or detecting it. I'd like to introduce you to Ivan Oransky. He's a distinguished journalist in resident at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, where he teaches medical journalism. He has done a lot of things around healthcare journalism, medical journalism, and scientific errors, fraud, retractions. He co-founded Retraction Watch, which tracks retractions globally and is an excellent resource for journalists of any beat. I want to introduce you to Elizabeth Bick. She is a microbiologist and science integrity consultant. She is amazing at spotting errors in research papers. Nature magazine, which is a prominent academic journal that also reports news on research, they called her a super spotter and the public face of image sleuthing. And then also Jody Cohen, a multinational award-winning journalist who reports for ProPublica. And she reported the series, The $3 Million Research Breakdown, which exposed misconduct in a psychiatric research study at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And her work ultimately resulted in the university having to return the money that it was given to do that research. So I'm going to, before we jump in, I'm going to hand the screen over to Ivan. But before that, I'm going to make a couple of quick announcements. We're going to reserve the last 10 minutes for audience questions because we probably will have a lot. If you'll submit your question in the chat box, please, and include your name and include your news outlet or the organization you work with, we would really appreciate that. JR's director, Carmen Noble, is going to be tracking the questions in the chat and getting them ready for our presenters. This webinar is being recorded and we'll post it on our website soon, along with a tip sheet that I'll put together to bring together the larger points that are made during the conversation. And then lastly, feel free to tweet and share the information you learn here. And then when the tip sheet is published, feel free to share it and feel free to republish it because all of our written content, as a reminder, is published under a Creative Commons license. So let's go ahead and start the presentation with Ivan. I'm gonna turn the screen over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Denise. And thanks to everyone for coming today. Wherever you are in the world, I can see there's people from all over the place, which is terrific. And let me go ahead and actually start this. Okay. And Denise, keep me honest. Everyone's looking at the right thing.
Yeah, I can see you're on your main page, the first page.
Great. So I'm going to, again, try and be really quick here. And I want to hear very much from Elizabeth and Jody, both of whose work I've followed with great respect and admiration for years. So I'm going to be quick, but I'm going to try and sort of take you through one story that other people did actually, and explain how they got it. I'm going to give you a couple of specific suggestions for where to look for stories and the sorts of things you can ask for and maybe even get. And then of course we'll have questions and comments after that. So I want, and I should just say that, you know, you're going to hear from Elizabeth Bick, so I'm going to not say too much about her role in all this, but it was pretty prominent and key in a couple of the cases that I'm going to mention, at least one in particular. And she can, of course, give you her own take on that and correct me if I've gotten anything wrong. So you've all probably heard by now that the president of Stanford stepped down from that post, although he's still a tenured faculty member, after a student, a reporter at the Stanford Daily uncovered some pretty damning stuff that led to, I'm giving the very sort of superficial story here, which you can read about, of course, in lots of places, but found he uncovered some allegations that others had actually uncovered about problems in some of Mark Tessier-Levine, that's the former president's name, his research. This was Theo Baker's first story in the Stanford Daily about a year ago now. A number, of course, followed. And again, Mark Tessier-Levine is now out as president. But that's the sort of the story. Again, Bick here, this is a second reference to Elizabeth Bick, who's our co-panelist here, of course, today. But this refers to, you know, really tells you how Theo Baker, you know, got this story, which is a site. Somehow he was directed to a site called pubpeer.com, which, interest of full disclosure, I'm a volunteer on their board of directors, so you should all know that, but it is a volunteer position. And so there were some allegations there from back in 2014, 2015. So by the time Theo Baker was actually looking at this, it was 9 years even later, I guess, 8 years later. He then went to, and you'll hear more from Elizabeth, of course, in a moment, went to corroborate these because, and these were, I should say, just to briefly explain what Elizabeth will explain in more detail, but just in sort of very much lay language, these were images that purported, it suggested that they were, you know, making, you know, findings and claims that supported some conclusions the papers were making, basically. And I won't get into more detail there, but they were images that were problematic or potentially problematic. He went to Elizabeth Bick, who corroborated these claims, and then he went to Stanford, and they said, "Oh, we're investigating," and all sorts of things happened after that. But I want to show you again, in the interest of trying to help you do these stories yourself. One of the things that I would definitely recommend is that if you go to PubPeer, you can actually download, you can install a browser extension. Chrome extension is the one I use, but they have it for multiple browsers. And so the reason why this shows up now, that gray bar at the top, is that the story from November 2022 actually links to various studies that, in this case, of course, were by Mark Tessier-Levine. And so what you get with the browser, which is free, and I would definitely encourage you to download and install, is anytime you're on a site that is either a paper itself or refers to a paper, in other words, links to a paper that has questions about it on pubpeer.com, which is where many scientists around the world leave, and non-scientists leave comments, often critical, about papers, and Elizabeth will tell you more about that in a moment. It's automatic. You don't have to think about it. It's there. You can also go to pubpeer.com, of course, and search yourself for whatever you're interested in, but I don't know, I'm kind of a lazy person, and I like things to come to me. And so I like it when I have a browser extension like that. The other thing I'll encourage you to do is to actually get to know the people who do this work, right? So again, you're going to hear from probably the world's certainly best known and most prominent sleuth today on this call, but there are lots of other folks who do various things. This is a page from Retraction Watch, which Denise mentioned. I co-founded. We update this periodically, and you probably can't even read it on your screens, but you can go find it on retractionwatch.com. You can find dozens of people who do this kind of work. There's a picture of Elizabeth from some years ago on there when we and others profiled her. People look at plagiarism. They look at statistical anomalies. They look at just weird ethical things, as Denise mentioned. All of these people are doing this kind of work, and they're the ones who are finding these problems. And it's like any kind of whistleblower or source that you can develop. One of the other places you can go is the Retraction Watch database to actually find. We have 45,000 retractions in our database now, which is far more than you'll find if you go to other places. We're always trying to keep up. We're always a bit behind also, but we're much further ahead than any other resource. And it's all available, by the way, to you now for free. It's always been available for free to search like this. You can actually download the entire thing now because we've been acquired by this database has been acquired by another nonprofit called Crossref. I can, give you more information about that later. I want to get into the weeds here now. But you can search for, your country, an institution near you, an author you're interested in, the subject, a journal, anything like that. And there will probably be a retraction related to something you're interested in. Just to give you a sense that retractions are still quite rare, that 1 in 1,000 papers published, but they're definitely on the increase. Don't be fooled by that somewhat downward trend at the end, just that these take a while. And so it looks that way, but actually we're sure that this is going to continue rising. We actually know it already has. We cut this off in 2020 for various reasons. But anyway, retraction is pretty rare. But what is a retraction? It means that something happened that means the paper should not be relied upon. That's literally all it means. Now, the reasons for retraction, which I put here, I will not go through all of these, but just to give you a sense, if you're thinking about it journalistically, retractions about 2/3 of the time are due to misconduct, some bad behavior. I don't know about you, but as a journalist, I typically think of bad behavior as a good story, right? So this is something where you can actually look and find all sorts of people doing all sorts of bad things, often with federal or in the case of international, public funding or about research that matters to people, like healthcare, health and medical research, for example. But that's not the only one. I think Denise included, roadway construction and engineering in the intro to this sort of talk, and that's something relevant. And so a couple other things you can do very quickly. One is you can file public records requests. I think you're going to hear more about that from Jody. I certainly hope you are, actually, because that's one of the stories that was a key part of the story that Denise mentioned. This is just to give you an example of something that we broke that turned into a big story down at the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Very quickly, the kinds of things you can request investigation reports. You can request correspondence between a given professor or a university and, say, a publisher, which we do a lot, or in a federal agency. Obviously, you can only do this with public institutions, and it depends on jurisdiction. I'm not going to get into the weeds there anyway. All know about public records laws in different places. But anyway, that's something to do. And the other thing, finally, I'll say is to become very comfortable searching court records. We find lots of cases, and again, here in the States, because I know a lot of you are not from the States, but in PACER, which is, of course, federal court system. This is a case we found here right nearby in the Southern District of New York. And so, again, sometimes these can be great stories. And lawyers tend to put a lot into the court records that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise, right? Investigation reports, correspondence, claims, all sorts of things. And so, okay, I'm going to just flash that for a second. Happy to follow up with anyone. And I'm going to stop sharing now, turn it over to, I believe, Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Elizabeth, would you mind giving your brief presentation as well?
Sure, of course.
We're excited to hear from you.
Yes. All right. Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing your entire screen.
Okay, and sorry, things are in the way of each other here.
Okay, maybe play?
Yeah, yes, but I couldn't reach that because it was covered by
There
the.
you go. There you go.
Okay,
There you are.
awesome. So,
That's
all right.
great.
So, my name is Elizabeth Bick. You can find me on my blog, Science Integrity Digest, on Twitter and on Blue Sky. I'm a microbiologist by training. I grew up and did my PhD in the Netherlands. And since 2013, I've been active first as a hobby and now full-time, trying to scan the biomedical literature for all kinds of problems, but focusing on image duplications. You can see some examples here on this slide. And I also have my financial disclosures, and that is because I quit my job and I'm a consultant now. So I get consultancy fees. And apparently a lot of people are who do not really appreciate my work, maybe because they're fans of the scientist whose work I've criticized. They keep on asking me, how do you get me your money and who's funding you? So I get donations through Patreon, and they're very curious about that. They want me to disclose my list of donors and things like that. And they have written whole Reddit pages on that. So I'm in disclosing here that I do receive donations because the work that I do criticizing science papers, there's not a lot of funding for that. And I've also worked for a fraudulent company. So you can look up on that. It's a whole story. But only the founders have been charged with insurance fraud and not none of the employees. So I was an employee there, but I do want to disclose it. I'm not going to hide that. So just a little reminder of what science misconduct is. Science misconduct itself is either plagiarism, so copying somebody else's text. I'm sure the whole audience knows what that is, and that's not good. It can also be falsification, where a person has obtained results in the lab or some measurements and changes the result just to make it look a little bit better. For example, a measurement could be changed by the researcher to become from a negative a positive, and maybe that makes their results look better. And then fabrication is where a person completely makes up results. So in the Netherlands, we had a case of Diederik Stapel, who is, I believe, on the Retraction Watch leaderboard with 58 retractions. He made up his study. So he didn't even do measurements. He just completely made it up. There's a lot of other things that can be wrong with science research, science papers. Usually they're called questionable research practices, and they're also worth reporting about. It could just be not publishing negative results, but it could also be not disclosing conflict of interest, or not doing any animal ethics, not obtaining an animal ethics permit, breaking any of the rules. Those are not typically called science misconduct, at least here in the US, but they are definitely worth criticizing papers about. So I also do a lot of those things as well when I write my reports on science papers. This is a little bit not completely focused. I'm sorry about that, but there's many people who do what I do. So I have a bunch of them listed here, and it's very similar to the Meet the Sleuths page in Retraction Watch. These are people active on Twitter or other social media, and they're either science critics, either working on plagiarism or focusing on images, such as I do, or on statistical errors, conflict of interest, citing their own papers a lot and making misuse of that, or writing or providing platforms for us to work with, so such as Retraction Watch and PUB here, where we can post our concerns. So just to shout out to many of these people, and you can imagine that not everybody wants to work under their full name, so some of them are using all kinds of pseudonyms, although recently some of these people have come out under their full name. But it is work, obviously, that doesn't leave you with a lot of fans, especially the people whose work we criticize are sometimes very mad about that, understandably so, but some of them have sued or threatened to sue some of us. So the work that I do focuses on image duplication. So I will look at scientific papers and find all kinds of duplicated areas. So moving from the left to the right on this slide, you will see an example of a simple duplication where the same panels have been reused to represent different experiments. You can see repositioned where two panels overlap with each other, or in this case, even three. And on the right, you can see an example of altered digitally altered images where parts of the image itself, parts of the photos have been or appear to have been duplicated. So these three types of duplication help you decide whether or not something is perhaps an honest error, such as the simple duplication on the left, or very likely to have been done deliberately with an intention to mislead, because photoshopping an image to make, for example, a protein band or a cell appear multiple times, that is very suggestive for an intention to mislead, and that would count as misconduct. Just some examples to test your own ability to spot these things. You can see here 4 different panels, or at least looking at the labels, there's supposed to be 4 different experiments. But if you look carefully, you might notice that 2 of these panels are identical. And I'll move along very quickly. So these 2 panels are identical. And not everybody sees that, but I think once you point it out with a colored box, most people will agree that these photos are the same. And again, this could be an honest error. Here's an example of a duplication with repositioning. So here we have overlapping panels, and not just 1 or 2 panels overlapping, but actually a lot of them. And this paper got retracted. And I think when you have that many errors, or you have to suggest, or you have to think that the authors were really not just making 1 error. They were either intentionally completely sloppy, or they were really they didn't do any of these experiments and they just showed the same sample over and over again, just moving it a little bit under the microscope. So this paper got retracted. And then here's an example of a type 3 duplication, so where we have duplicated elements within photos. And this is a quite extreme example. And so this is the photos, these are the photos as published in the scientific paper. But if you look carefully, you might spot that many of these elements have been duplicated. And so you have to wonder how the real photo looked like and why this was done. And this is a more recent find, and this paper has not been retracted or corrected at all. And the University of Texas hasn't even commented on a bunch of papers that I found with similar problem. So this is, Ivan already mentioned this, you can use Papier. So I, as an image sleuth, use Papier to comment on these problems, but as a journalist or as an interested reader, you can use Papier to check for concerns. So if you, again, I will also plug the Papier plugin or Chrome extension. I'm also using the Chrome extension, but I have them for other browsers as well. If you have that Papier plugin installed and you do a literature search, as you can see here on the left, you will see these green banners appear whenever a paper has a Papier comment. So if you click on those, you will go to the Papier post. And also if you go to a journal website, you will see this green banner appear when that paper has received a comment. It is dependent on the DOI, which is the unique identifier being present on that website. So if it sees that DOI for that paper, it will show that green banner and you can click on it. So on the right, you can see what people had to say about this paper. And Papier is heavily moderated. You cannot just say you're a fraud. You have to come with evidence and arguments, similarly to a peer review report where you have to, if you're critical, you have to show why you're critical and prove that. And so it is moderated and you cannot just say what you want. It's not just smearing. Some people say it's smearing somebody's reputation, but it is actually quite polite and rightfully so. Otherwise, this would be, of course, setting up people for legal challenges. I'm very worried about generative artificial intelligence because it can generate fake text, fake images, fake data sets. And this is only the beginning. And I'm sure that any journalist is very worried about that. We already heard several stories where journalists were made up or stories were made up. And even images are so essential to the way we like to read a story, because as humans, we're very visual. And if we see a photo, we tend to think that something happened. And so it's nowadays very easy to make fake photos of events that have never happened, or to create fake photos of people who do not exist. And just some examples on the left that are funny. but you can imagine that you can do something with scientific photos or scientific data sets as well. So I'm very worried about that. And then finally, why is there research misconduct? Just touching on that. And I believe that one of the reasons is that the rewards are so big to do misconduct, right? There's, if you fake your results, if you make them look better, it's just easier to publish. It's faster. You don't have to go to the lab. You can actually generate your whole experiment and fabricate it in a spreadsheet, for example. So everything will look much better if you fake it. And so it's easier to get grants. It's easier to publish. You get more citations. You are just more successful if you do fraud. And the consequences, on the other hand, are very few. It seems that there's relatively very few papers that have big problems that get corrected or retracted. Institutional investigations take years to perform, and there's very rarely an action. And senior researchers, who are the leaders, the mentors, the supervisors, and the responsible people for these things happening in their lab, they are rarely held accountable. Often they throw one of their junior researchers under the bus, as we say here in the US, meaning they put the blame on a junior researcher, and they just can keep on frauding, it appears. These people are still getting grants and can remain at their position. The Stanford president stepping down being a very rare exception. And the sanctions from institutions like the National Science Foundation or the Office of Research Integrity are very mild, relatively speaking. And so when you have this imbalance, you get people cheating because the rewards are big, the consequences, the chance of getting caught or reprimanded are very low. And just think how things like traffic would be if, or sports with doping, if doping was allowed and everybody was looking the other way, if speeding was totally fine and you would never have a chance to get caught, everybody would be using doping in sport and everybody would be speeding in traffic. And I feel that science could use with a little stronger stance on what we do with people being caught doing misconduct. And I hope journalists will play a role in that, because if we have to rely on journals and institutions, it appears nothing or very rarely things will happen. We need stories like the Stanford president. We need reporters to write about these cases to get things moving. So thank you, and look forward to the discussion. And now I just have to find my stop share and my cursor, which is very hard. All right, there we go.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jody, I'd like to pop over to you, please. I was hoping that you would tell the audience a little bit about your investigative series, and then if you could also share some examples of some of the larger challenges you faced while you were reporting that out.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. I am probably the rookie on this panel, Ivan and Elizabeth being the experts, but I will discuss and hopefully share some tips on how to report on research misconduct for a lay audience, maybe. So I wrote a story a few years ago, did an investigation about a University of Illinois psychiatrist who maybe this would fall into Ivan's category of bad behavior equals good story. And it had a lot of those components in that there was money involved that eventually had to be returned, federal money. There was harm. This was a clinical study. There were young children involved who were harmed. And this actually Retraction Watch was onto this way before I was. Retraction Watch published several stories about retractions of this psychiatrist's, this University of Illinois Chicago psychiatrist's work. The stories were being retracted. It was very difficult to get records showing what had happened. And I think that's where I came in. I learned about the potential problems from a tip saying that the university was being ordered to return $3 million, which, as Elizabeth just said, one issue is that there are rarely sanctions, right? There's misconduct, but the sanctions are mild and few consequences. So in this case, the government, the federal government, was ordering UIC to repay this money. That was the tip. I didn't force that to happen or anything, but that's where this started. And because that was so rare, I did some digging around and tried to actually figure out how rare that was, which you would think that NIH would be able to tell you that bit of information, but they cannot, which is ridiculous. And so I used Freedom of Information Act, many public records requests. I think ultimately I probably filed 10 or more to the University of Illinois. And that's really how I was able to tell this story about what had happened. I'm going to tell you some of the documents that I requested that ends up being helpful. And maybe I could share these, and Denise can post them for everyone to see the requests so you can know what's available. But there are all kinds of documents that are available when a public institution is getting federal money, and all kinds of reporting, some of which you cannot get under public records requests because of various exemptions. But we were able to get, documents about the faculty member, the researcher, clinician, including, all of her most of her employment records. We were, as it relates to this, well, even like number of patients that she was seeing, just like numbers, because there was no confidentiality there, just to show. One issue here was that the university was continuing to tout her as this amazing psychiatrist, amazing doctor, even after knowing there were problems. So we wanted to see her, like her patient visits, like what was happening with there. But as it relates to the actual research, we were able to get letters, requests, letters, notes, memos, communication between the university and her and the college and the department that she was in, and NIH and National Institute of Mental Health and the various other federal branches that were looking into her. We requested reports, including findings related to HHS and NIH's investigations into her grants. This was a good one. Copies of all payments from the university or the department or the College of Medicine to HHS or NIH. This was to show that they had to repay the money, and we actually got a copy of the check, the $3 million check, which became the lead image on this story. And we requested emails. This was hundreds of pages of emails we got back, like all correspondence between the people within the college. So the people from who were on the IRB and her supervisors about the problems. Let's see, what else did we? Well, this was a good one. Subpoenas. So you can request subpoenas in Illinois, at least, and I think many other states. So we were able to see that the investigations had been started into her work. We were able to get the informed consent documents, parent permission forms, and these eventually showed some of the misconduct. Like what happened was her study was looking at the effect of lithium on children with bipolar disorder. And there were stipulations, like she could not enroll any children under 13. They couldn't have been on other psychotropic meds. They couldn't have like withdrawn from other meds to enroll in her study. She couldn't enroll her patients in the study. And ultimately, she enrolled like 86% of the 103 children she enrolled in her study were not actually eligible under the conditions. Denise's question about like what was really difficult. The real difficulty here was the university wanted to just put all the blame on her and not take ownership of where the IRB failed and where the university failed in overseeing her work. So it's easy for them to just brush off accountability to her. Where at ProPublica, we really wanted to be able to show that the university was at fault too. It was not just the doctor. And the challenge here was that the university withheld all kinds of records that showed their culpability. And we ended up having to hire a lawyer and appeal to the attorney general, and that's the process in Illinois, to get the records that they were redacting or totally withholding, that showed that the university's IRB was in serious non-compliance, that they did not properly review her protocols. They just, all kinds of safeguards that they were supposed to do, they just did not. After a year, we got a ruling in our favor and were able to get those records and then tell that second part of the story.
Could I get you to explain some of the acronyms that you've used? IRB.
Oh, sorry.
I think it was
Yeah.
like HHS, like some
Sorry,
of the federal
sorry.
organizations.
Okay, Health and Human Services, and IRB. So the IRB is the Institutional Review Board. So when you have, when there's a researcher, Ivan, correct me if I explain this wrong, but if there's research involving human subjects like this one, there are, the university has, or not just the university, but there needs to be an institutional review board, a panel who is assigned to review the protocols of that study, to make sure there's informed consent, to make sure that the individuals enrolled in the study follow the guidelines of the study. For example, like this one, no children under 13 were supposed to be enrolled in this study testing lithium. And it ended up that there were children enrolled as young as 8 and 9. But if the IRB had been doing its job and looking at the informed consent documents and looking at who was enrolling in the study, they would have flagged that and said, you cannot enroll these individuals. So the IRB is there to protect the individuals enrolling in a clinical study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the federal organization that deals with grants, which one is that one?
So it depends on the study, but for this grant had been, it was the granting organization was the National Institute of Mental Health, but
Okay.
a National Institute of Health is, the, it's all, another grant, it's under the National Institute of Health.
Okay, great.
And the Office of Research Integrity is supposed to monitor research integrity. And there's also the Office of Human Research Protections, OHRP, I think that's correct, is supposed to be the organization that really protects from the granting side, from the federal level, the protecting the individuals who are involved in studies.
And those are both federal organizations.
Those
correct?
ORI
Federal
and
agencies?
OHRP are both federal. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, so you ran into a bunch of roadblocks where either people would delay information that you eventually got, or they just wouldn't return phone calls or not give you information. Can you talk about some of the workarounds you used to get at that information? I think that would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, well, I had people helping me within the university, but I think one of the looking at it from a journalist perspective,
Mm-hmm.
the story really needed to show the harm, right? Were people harmed by this? By enrolling, 86% of the people enrolling should not have been enrolled. So you wanted to find the people involved. And like I said, the university was out there touting this professor. So she was on the news sometimes talking about her groundbreaking work. She had founded this mood disorders clinic. So we went back and found, some of the press releases and the stories about her. And sometimes they would have patients on the news talking about how great she was. And we contacted them. She wrote a book, and there were Amazon book reviews that we were able to reach out to people who reviewed her book, Google reviews. They're like finding people through social media who knew her, who were her patients. And eventually when we published the first story, we asked for people to contact us. It was sort of felt like a needle in the haystack because there were only 103 people who were enrolled in her study, but we ended up hearing from them, and we featured one family in a follow-up story who had kept a journal of their time in that study and the harm it was creating. or really the harm it had on him. And to this day, I actually still hear from people who were enrolled in that study. The story published, I don't know, four years ago, probably. But I just want to give another, like, a shout out again to Retraction Watch, because they, like, also that was a huge resource in trying to understand this, and especially like having never covered academic fraud or research fraud, it was, yeah, huge. I mean, the amount of information there and the ability to use that database, completely amazing.
Yes, I will second that. If you haven't checked it out, take some time to look around. Lots of interesting information.
And the blog, like all the posts, I don't, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Fabulous.
The database, being able to kind of look up authors in your area, institutions in your backyard, that kind of thing. I'm going to, because we've got about 9 minutes, and I want to get to some questions for all of the speakers we're talking to. One question that I was wondering was, what should journalists be on the lookout for? So you're covering your beat, and how do you recognize an error or misconduct when you come across it? Or, where are you going to seek it out? I know you talked about PubPeer, a very great resource. I know you talked about Retraction Watch, another resource. But like in your day-to-day, you're on the beat. Where are you finding it? How do you find it? If any of you can weigh in on that, please.
I don't know if we're the best people in some ways, and when I say we, I mean, I guess me and Jody in different ways, Elizabeth's obviously in a different role. I mean, I think the things that we mentioned that you just mentioned also are where we find things. We have a full-time research director, and actually she has an associate researcher now, who are doing nothing but looking for retractions, because we have this whole database which is part of what we do. And in fact, it's sort of, we think of it the way that ProPublica, has for years created resources alongside the fantastic journalism they do, right? So it's great, you do the story, you get it out there, you have an impact, but now anyone can go and search. And so we're literally getting tips about retractions. Allison and Brightest, our researchers, finding retractions like every day. There were more than 6,000 last year. They're going to be even more than that this year by the time the year's up. So they're happening, all the time. Again, you can keep tabs on PubPeer and what have you. You'll get tips. I mean, one of the things that I would encourage people to do is to let people know you're interested in doing this kind of work. And the best way to do that is to do the work. I know that's a little bit of a catch-22, but once you start doing this, I mean, we were one of the only news outlets that was doing this on any regular basis in 2010. It's not no longer the case. We have tons of competition. The minute we launched, we were flooded with tips, and now we get even more. And that's great. It's wonderful. We can't keep up with all of them. But let people know you're interested in this by doing it, and you'll get tips like that.
Okay. Jody, did you say that you also got some tips from inside the university?
Yes, I think what Ivan said is so true. It's like you write about it and then people come to you, right? Like they don't know you're there and interested in this unless you're covering it regularly, or even not even just regularly, but like you start writing about it and show that this is something that you're interested in, and you're going to get more ideas. I mean, I would say if you're covering a specific institution, like a specific university or a region, and this is an area that you're interested in, which I think is really ripe for investigations because it is not covered like it should. I mean, you could request records, just, a little bit of a fishing expedition, but seeing, if money's been repaid on, from grants, and you could just start, digging around a little bit at the institutions that you cover. In addition to like setting up the extensions for PubPeer and catching stuff and regularly checking Retraction Watch, and you can search, NIH, you can search the grants and the see where the money is flowing, like who is getting the most money, and that's just one way to get grant money through NIH, but that's what I know. And it's try to just, I don't know, like be skeptical and ask some questions of the data and ask the questions of the people that you cover.
Great, great, great. And then I'm thinking this will be a really good question. And maybe Elizabeth, you could weigh in on this. At what point in the reporting process should the journalist be seeking out a science integrity consultant, someone with that kind of expertise? And then, I know that both Elizabeth and Ivan shared lists of experts who do this work, but how do you find one that is willing to help guide a journalist and help look at data or read the research to help them vet it on the record for a news report? Because
Yeah,
that's
it's a great question, and I think it should be pretty early on. I imagine all the cases I've worked with are journalists who have received tips about scientific papers with problems, and then they reach out to me to ask if I can walk them through the problems and tell if it's are these honest errors? Could it be an honest errors? Is it just making the results look a little bit better? But is it not too bad? On what scale should they place how bad a particular concern is? And so I've done a lot of that. And I think it's very good to do that early on in the research, because I also imagine you don't want to call out people and write a whole article, and then it's a nothing burger. It's just a little beautification. And so I think as a journalist, you want to make sure that you really have a good foundation to build your article on. And so I'm always happy to help with that. But having said that, I don't think there's a lot of people who would do that on the record with their full name. I think I'm one of the few, although there's a growing army of people who are very good in looking at these images and have recently come out with their identity. So I do think there's more and more people. We all have our own specialties. I cannot really help with statistical error. So I think the list that Retraction Watch has is a great resource. Maybe we could add what our specialties are, because if you contact me again about statistical errors, I have no idea. You want to talk to Nick Brown or James Hadders or people like that. So that is a great resource. But I also am very worried about legal threats that we as whistleblowers or science critics receive. Recently, we've seen the Data Colada lawsuit that they criticized the work of a Harvard professor, and she is now suing the science critic. So I do think that is a very big negative change, in that people like us will be a little bit less likely to talk on the record. So I'm not sure where that is going. I think we need just better anti-SLAPP laws in all states, not just in all countries in the world, so that we cannot just be sued by bringing up legit concerns.
That brings up another great question that hopefully one or two or all of you can weigh in on. What about journalists? What should journalists maybe prepare themselves for in terms of responses from the researchers involved or the public? And then are there things they could be doing to protect themselves?
I mean, one thing is I encourage people to, understand that you will be at risk. I mean, the same way you do any hard-hitting reporting, you're writing about people's livelihoods essentially, right? And so we know, as was mentioned, that there are litigious researchers and scientists. We carry our own libel insurance, which obviously I would hope that all of the news organizations you work for do. And sometimes you might want to even get a story lawyered, in advance. If you're a freelancer, that's going to be more challenging, and you want to be working with a news organization that A, has insurance, and B, knows what it's doing. We've seen a lot of people get into trouble who are actually right, but who use words that tend to basically invite legal threats. We think that's really unfortunate, because it's a way for people to discount the work of people who are actually funding important things. Also take the kind of precautions that You know, the Dart Center, I think, and Pulsar Center sort of together think about in terms of your own safety. There are, you know, people make threats, never mind legal threats, but other threats. You know, the same way if you were covering anything controversial, think about protecting yourself that way.
Jody, did you by chance get any kind of harassment or face anything like that?
No, but to add to what Ivan said, which I think those are all good suggestions, is to make sure that as best you can, that the researcher, the person you're writing about, knows what you're writing, has ample opportunity to respond, to go over the information with them. And we have a, you can call it like a no surprises philosophy at ProPublica, where people who are in the story should not be surprised by what they, you know, when they read the story. So, you know, the doctor in the story, you know, I spoke with her several times, emails, she, you know, knew what was going to be in the story, had the chance to respond. So I think that's like just another way to protect yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got 8 minutes, and so I'm going to go right to Carmen, the director of Journalist Resource, and ask her to, if you could read some questions for us.
Yes, we'll do. And I will say we have a ton of questions. We're probably not going to be able to get to all of them. So in the event that we don't get to them, we will collect them and share them and try to answer them later. So the first one is, it's a related question to what you've been talking about. The work that the sleuths do is invaluable, but there are sometimes unfairly targeted online. And I will say personally, I've noticed that Elizabeth is targeted all the time on Twitter. So I guess 2 parts to that question. One, how do you handle that kind of online harassment as these whistleblowers? And 2, what is your view on anonymous sleuths who may be anonymous to protect themselves, but can journalists trust what anonymous sleuths are saying on Twitter?
I really like to hear, unless it's too traumatic, of course, Elizabeth's take on this. I know she speaks about this, so I don't think it's prying, but in terms of protecting oneself, I think, you know, this whole like, oh, anonymous sources are bad. I mean, that's a whole discussion for journalism. Anonymous sources that are powerful to me are bad. Anonymous sources that are vulnerable, which a whistleblower is, which someone in a lab who's pointing out problems is, especially a junior person. That's, as long as you know who they are, your editor knows who they are. That's my rule. You know, we're good with that. We want to understand why they want anonymity, but it's usually pretty obvious. The nice thing about the work that Elizabeth does, that the anonymous folks do, is that they show exactly what they're doing. This isn't somebody, as Elizabeth said, posting like fraud in a theater, you know, at Pub Pier. It's, you know, okay, here's a thing that looks weird. Here's another thing that looks weird. Here's a statistical problem. Then you check it out, and you do as Theo Baker did, take it to someone like Elizabeth who's willing to go on the record using her name. And then you validate it. And it's actually pretty basic journalism. And there's a kind of like, I'll maybe I'm saying too much, but sometimes when I hear people sort of say, you know, well, can we trust all this because there's some anonymity? I just wonder, like, is that really the motivation, or is it that they want to sort of knock down this, you know, sort of these group of people, which I think is a real problem. Not to say there aren't bad actors who use anonymity for that purpose, but that's such a small number. And we've been doing this work for 13 years. I don't, that's not the problem we're dealing with here.
Great, thank you.
And I'd be happy to talk about like harassment. Yeah, I mean, I realize that my work doesn't make certain friends in certain parts of the scientific world. If I criticize a paper or a person, I try to play it on the papers, not criticizing persons, but that sometimes results in their fans lashing out at me, or the people who have invested in a stock, which is another special type of fan. People have lost money because the stock of their favorite company fell after, you know, criticism about their papers came to light. And those people tend to play it on the person. So they will start to harass me, talk about my appearance, the way I look, the way I sound, the way what I've done, where I've worked in the past. And so these are all ad hominem attacks. Sometimes they attack my papers, but it's really meant to silence me. And it's getting increasingly worse. And people are now, there's this morning, some guy who lost a lot of money on his stock, who is just on a rant. He's just ranting every day about how I should be stripped of my PhD because of what I do. And it's frustrating because he's actually sending emails to journalists as we speak, trying to target and damage my reputation. And it's really frustrating because people like that, in the beginning, you think it's just an anonymous troll, but in the end, this is a very rich guy. He can hire a very good lawyer. And I don't think that these debates should be held in the courtroom. It shouldn't be who can afford the best lawyer, and that's the person who's going to win these legal cases. I cannot afford, to hire a lawyer because I'm not, I don't have a job. I'm running on Patreon, donations. And so I don't think I am wrong because I cannot defend myself the way that those folks can. And I think we're now in this stage where these science discussions about fraud are moving to the courtroom, and it's just not good for science. And we should work on better protection of legit critics who raise legit concerns, and there should be funds to protect these folks if they're threatened to be sued. And again, I'm calling out for better anti-SLAPP laws, as we call them in the US. So a SLAPP would be a lawsuit trying to silence a critic. And we need anti-SLAPP laws to, if you have legit concerns, you can prove it because these papers have been published. I'm looking at images, like it's very clear there's a problem. I'm not doing any illegal detective work. I'm looking at published in the public domain. I'm looking at published images and raising concerns about that.
Okay, great. Oh, Denise, you're on mute.
I was just
I
saying.
love the comments, by the way.
Yeah.
The comments are yay.
I would say we have 2 minutes, so maybe we can squeeze in one more. I'll be quiet so we can get right to that.
Okay. I will ask a question that was answered in the chat, but I get this question all the time, so I'd like to hear it out loud on the record from Gary Grimm, which is, why are these errors not routinely caught by the peer review process?
Yeah, so I answered that. Just I was doing some answering because I figured we wouldn't get to everything in a few words. Peer review, I'll just say it, peer review is oversold. I think the amount of quality assurance that it can actually do has always been oversold. I think we should understand that as journalists. If nothing else, maybe this discussion can inform how you're going to write about science and health and other scholarly subjects, even if you never report on fraud itself. The point is that if you add up the number of hours you'd need, a number of scientists you'd need to peer review actual experts to peer review all these papers, you would run out of time, money, everything. And by the way, it's unpaid. So I actually am no longer surprised at peer review. I know other people are, because publishers have told us that it's such a great thing that it's finding all these errors. It doesn't. And and we know this because when bad things happen and there are retractions, often for fraud, editors admit, like they did to the New York Times during the pandemic, that in fact peer review is not set up to catch these problems. They don't put that on their marketing materials, oddly. So let's sort of be more honest about what peer review can and can't do. By the way, I still think we should do peer review. I just don't think we should think that it's this false binary. If it's right because it's peer reviewed, it's not right because it wasn't.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that was perfect. It is 1 o'clock. I am going to thank all of our speakers profusely for taking time to chat with me about this topic and to share this information with other journalists. And I'm thanking all of you for joining us for the last webinar of the year. And please look out for the tip sheet that'll be coming out soon. We'll put that on our website. We'll let you know via social media when it's there, if you don't check back. And then also it will be in our weekly email. So thank you all.